Eminence was an ambitious role-playing project, hailed as a revolution in roleplay and the heir apparent of one of the most popular hardcore roleplay servers back in the early 2000s, which had hundreds of active players and people who remember it fondly to this day. Eminence, 17 years after Haze, was well advertised on Reddit. Players were excited for the launch. This was Eminence at launch, this was Eminence after a few months. So it didn't quite live up to the hype of the original game world. In this video, we'll explore the why this project failed to achieve the kind of numbers it was going for, and why it sank so fast. But let's start at the beginning, and ironically, it all began with me. So in December 5th, 2020, I released a video telling the story of Haze, a very special, players-driven game world that once existed through the game engine Neverwinter Nights. I played it when I was a teenager. I guess you can think of Haze as what if you try to create a fantasy multiplayer experience that can generate the same intensity level, stories and realism of novelized fantasy stories that we know. Except, the awesome thing is that in roleplay, nothing is predetermined since we're playing it live. If that sounds difficult to achieve, that's cause it is. The idea is to make it as immersive as possible, as gritty as possible, so that beautifully epic storylines can happen organically. Of course, there is the game aspect to it, in our case D&D, so players still have their levels, equipment, feats and skills. Each player can only play one character, and each character only had one life. No one in Haze has plot immunity, from the lowliest halfling to the righteous leader of the hamlets. They are all mortal. But also, no less important, they had the power to affect change. So, despite the fact that it was fantasy, realism was in its core. In those years Haze was online, it was very popular. It managed to capture the imagination of fantasy fans. It truly felt like we were characters from a fantasy novel. We even ran our own hamlets. Not the game masters, the players, playing out storylines that felt realistic, that felt epic. A world where our character's life and death had meaning. Even though it was an island, supposedly not that big, it still felt like a world. It was fantastic, but it only lasted for 2 years. So, 17 years later, I posted this video telling the story of Haze, and it started a chain of events that I couldn't imagine. Former players from back in the days began posting comments reminiscing about their experiences in Haze. Then there is this one comment, that user, Ollie D. That's the original creator of Haze, the main guy. Long story short, we all got together on Facebook and said, let's do it again, only better. We picked up the same tool that we used last time to make it, Neverwinter Nights. Though it was 19 years old, amazingly it was still the best tool there is, and even recently got a facelift with a whole new lighting engine. So, development began. The product was baptized as Eminence. So, Eminence was a convict colony set in the Forgotten Realms. Players played as the convicts that needed to fill a quota of a resource called Vividium, and if they don't do it on time, they get hanged. The main hub was a city called Erstwhile, and it wasn't enough to just find Vividium. Convicts also needed to get a job to survive. Gameplay-wise, it was like a fantasy convict simulation game with role-playing. Yeah, there's a description. It was designed for 100 players and more, the idea being that players would make it feel alive with DM events and epic stories. So, what happened? Well, look, before I start, I wasn't a part of the development team. I was just a player, and the only reason I'm doing this video is because Haze, that original project, inspired so many themes and topics in my channel that I want to see it succeed. So being critical on a public platform can seem a bit harsh. It's not meant as an offense, but constructive criticism that hopefully we can all take something from, even viewers who never tried or even heard of this platform called role-playing. Let's start. This is my character, Wilhelm, walking in the city of Erstwhile, the main hub of players. It was kinda big, felt like a walk-in simulator at times, designed for 100 players, but because only about 20 were playing at peak, it kinda made it feel emptier than it was supposed to feel. Now, I mentioned there was a job system. Here is Brokath cleaning the docks. There is no good being a waiter, and there is Telford just standing behind the counter being all tavern keeper-like. And here is my character, Wilhelm, mining granite. Here is Will again, working as a mason. There were two types of jobs really, scripted and non-scripted. Scripted means you had to click on stuff, start your shift, roleplay yourself doing it, and then click to finish your shift. It was a system based on trust. Essentially, the longer you stayed in the game, the more you were rewarded. It was a type of grind, roleplay grind. It was a system that, by design or not, encouraged addiction. I know one player who just had a second monitor at work just so he could hoard more gold. He actually told me I put in 11 hours easy, 8 at work and 3 at home. Wilhelm's first job was scripted. He was a miner, like every starting character was, and it was painfully boring. I just wanted to get some interaction, so I roleplayed as though my character is having a breakdown because of that job. That got me my first bit of interaction. After a while, I got an unscripted job as a mason. You can think of unscripted jobs as DM-sponsored jobs. The Dungeon Masters pay special characters who pay to the characters that are working for them. More about those special characters later. Okay, so you essentially get a job and you roleplay that job. You see, theoretically, as roleplayers, we could make something out of nothing, which is exactly what most of those jobs wanted you to do, to play act without necessarily anything tangible. We're pretty damn good at that. The question really becomes, is it worth our time as creative individuals to invest in roleplay mostly based on intangibles? Is it fun? Is the big question. For me, the answer was no, it wasn't. I don't want my very roleplay to be a grinding experience. The job system, it reminded me of those jobs in GTA where you're a garbage collector or whatever, and that's how you improve your character. To me, it always felt like pointless over-gamification, and I think that's what this project failed to understand, that we're not gamers, we're artists. If we were gamers, we'd be playing all those other games and wouldn't even look at the sim roleplay convict colony made with an old engine. There were, however, special jobs, or rather positions, that had a bit more merit, like a tavern keeper where you can organize events. Here we see Galthane trying to organize events for his tavern. Or the owner of a gambling den, Walby, my game boss, who probably organized the most events on the server. Those type of positions had more tangible roleplay tools, and those characters were very much in demand. Those characters were designated as special characters called Eminence Characters. They were being delegated perks and tools from the DMs to perform their role. Thing is, once they became Eminence Characters, I never really thought of them as players anymore, but staff members, kinda like DMs that can only portray one NPCs. To be fair though, despite their privilege, they could die like everyone else, and it actually happened. Now, we can't talk about Eminence without talking about Vividium, that special type of secret mineral that needed to be collected for the colony. There was a quota that characters had to fulfill. The punishment of not making your quota is getting hanged. Allegedly. In practice, it didn't really happen. I was asked for my papers 4 times in a month. Half the time I was without my papers, they were good for 14 days. I got a warning once for not having them. But it was really mostly a role-playing tool, and at certain times it was even kind of fun. Here is a Vividium checkup in the market square. The DM-controlled NPC was really giving it to the convicts. It was kind of fun to watch. The whole thing certainly gave players something to do and talk about, but there was this other side of it. It created a forced liability to keep playing because you were on the clock to have those papers on time. And by design, that Vividium stuff wasn't easy to find, but it was necessary to find it. So, both the job systems and the Vividium requirements, it made Eminence a life-consuming design that highly valued long play hours over quality play hours. I just wasn't willing to invest that much time in it. It was one of the reasons that my character never leveled up, while people around me did. Here's a quote from a player that summarizes it well. I have limited time to play because I have work, I have bills to pay to keep a roof over my head, so when I log in, I want to roleplay with people, not go farm. It goes back to the whole issue of excessive gamification, where the thing is, The reason why people play, and I can't stress this enough, is role-playing with other people, the interaction between players. That's the bread and butter of our enterprise here. That's what they can't get in all those other games, that level of roleplay immersion, and somehow this, the most important of aspects, was just not prioritized. The high mortality rate. It was like everything in Eminence was a fight. You couldn't possibly get by without frequently fighting, whether you were looking for Vividium or going on DM quests, which naturally led to a lot of deaths, and I mean a lot. I guess you can think of it as some ways fun. I mean, you log in and hey, who died today? And it almost keeps things interesting, right? But Eminence was murdering characters left and right. It was like the average lifespan was 2 weeks. Heck, I wasn't even logged in for a day or two and people kept telling me, "Oh, I thought you died. Good thing you're still alive." "Why does everyone keep telling me that?" was always my character's reply. All in all, the consequences of high mortality rate became evident, players got distraught and left, and that's the price of permadeath. That's the careful balance that a permadeath world has to maintain. Too dangerous and everybody dies, too soft and people lose interest. It's pretty clear why it stood in Eminence. In every DM event that I was in, I was near death, sometimes even multiple times during a single session, and if I wasn't playing careful, I should have died a lot sooner. Honestly, I just wanted to have more footage material because I felt it wouldn't last long. And if it was really a low magic settings as it proclaimed to be, we should have all died a heck of a lot sooner. But magic was kinda abandoned. Magical healing hands and potions were all over the place. All that said, I think there was a far bigger problem which was lying deeper at the core of what Eminence was. A convict colony. Not a dynamic world where players build and expand, not a players-driven experience where characters could revolt against the powers that be and, God forbid, take over. None of the dynamic stuff, no. It was a convict colony, and it was gonna stay a convict colony. I know this because I was exposed to the philosophy in development stages. To me, that was the biggest crime. That was actually my line in the sand why I couldn't possibly stay on as a staff member. Once I realized that, I was out before we started. I spoke about the issue of power to the players in another video, but I think one other Eminence staff member said it beautifully. If it's not a player-controlled hamlet, what's the point? Ends up feeling like a museum to the player than a world they can touch and shape. Well said. To be fair to Eminence though, it's impossible to compare its players' numbers to Haze without talking about the time period. 2003 was before World of Warcraft and before all those RPGs and survival games came out. So yeah, there were a lot more players playing Neverwinter Nights back then, and it made it so much easier to get players, even if it wasn't all that good all the time. I mean, it was better, sure, it was a much more open-ended experience, but the Haze of 2003-2004 got a lot more passes because there wasn't this oversaturation of games offering immersive experiences. In 2021, there are about only a quarter of the amount of players in Neverwinter Nights, and that's if I'm being generous. Most of them are kinda settled in their chosen servers or campaigns anyway. So launching a new server wasn't gonna be easy either way. But I thought that 20-25 players at peak for the first few weeks was pretty respectful, and to be fair, it's not like there is a better tool out there. Neverwinter Nights may be old, but it's still infinitesimally easier to create your own mini-fantasy MMO than in any other engine. So I think it was a good choice, especially considering the resources that we had. Anyway, Eminence just never took off the way it was intended to. It died young, still in open beta. A lot of systems weren't ripe and it was starting to show. Overpowered creatures causing frequent deaths, players finding ways to power game and level up their characters. I even heard there was so much gold and Vividium in circulation that both have become almost meaningless at some point. If there are weak points to the design, rest be assured, players will find it. Eminence owes its initial small success to its dungeon masters, who kept players entertained, possessing NPCs and running DM events, In fact, there was even an over-reliance on DMs and the Eminence characters to keep the players entertained, otherwise there was not much meat on the bone. Now, the only reason I wanted to play Eminence was because of this: Permadeath. Eminence had a true Permadeath experience, and you're just not gonna find any true Permadeath experiences out there. They're not just rare, they don't exist. Maybe one, and even then it's not graphical. I spoke about it more in my Permadeath video and the differences between Permadeath and pseudo-Permadeath for role-playing servers. A lot of game worlds claim to be Permadeath and then you find out they're not. So for me, it was an opportunity to finally capture what true Permadeath means, live, as it happens, seeing characters mourn, seeing how they react with a real fear of death. You're just not gonna find characters reacting like that in a non-Permadeath server. Yes, Eminence was an underdeveloped, tone-deaf mess, but the hardcore essence, the value of Permadeath, that still shined through. Here is the execution of Og the Orc. I thought this moment beautifully captured an essence of the intensity and fear. That moment was special. It's something you couldn't get in any other game, and I'm very glad that I was there to capture it. It made me really glad that I played Eminence. It even reconnected me to the text-based style of roleplay and made me reappreciate its advantages. Death had meaning, and that part I channeled through my character. Like when he found two corpses by the temple, he was outraged and compelled to bury them properly and give them a sermon. That theme was evident throughout my character's existence. Whenever he encountered a body, especially one of a player that died in battle, he paid it its due respect. Eminence gave me a lot of material that I can use to talk about all sorts of role-playing themes. There is so much to be said about a range of topics that I can't possibly cover it all in one video. So from my personal perspective, it was definitely worth playing. Overall though, I think Eminence was a worthwhile creation because it rekindled the passion of old Haze players to roleplay, and it introduced new players to the concept of our hardcore style and resurrected the spirit of our old community. That, I think, is by far Eminence's greatest achievement. It's awakened a sleeping giant. And maybe, just maybe, a new project will rise from the ashes of the old one. If you want to see my experiences in Eminence, watch the 3 narrated movies I made. It's from my character's point of view. There is the Haze explanatory documentary that I made and also the Haze movie, so if you like that kind of stuff you got some viewing material. Any new projects I will post in the description of this video.